Dear colleagues, good afternoon again, and thank you for finding time to join us today. Today, we are hosting the last webinar in the NIVA and SPC Learning Exchange webinar series. With great pleasure, I shout a big thank you to all of you and to all of the guests who attended any of the past webinars. We had presence from the members of NIVA, SPC, MFAT, DFAT, SPREP, Geoscience Australia, GNS Science, ADPC, and now FFA too. It is you, the audience, who made the series of events a success. Again, thank you very much. I would also like to mention the organizing team of this initiative, consisting of Doug Ramsey and Cameron Christopher from NIVA, and Camille Menauer and myself, Alexander Zhivadovic from SPC. Our emails are at the top of the chat box. Please do not hesitate to contact us if you have questions, comments, or suggestions on our work. We have received a lot of feedback from you, but we would really appreciate if you completed the survey that we prepared for this occasion. The survey link is in the chat box. Please click on it and complete now or during the presentation session. Many thanks for that. Your opinion is what will bind us to do this even better when we and if we do it again. Before I announce the presenters for today, a few housekeeping matters. The webinar will last for about 60 minutes, 45 for the presentation and 10 to 15 for questions and answers. The event is recorded and the recording will be published on the SPC's YouTube channel, and the link to the recording will be made available on the SPC website. Please mute your microphone and close your camera to minimize bandwidth needs. Please questions until the questions and answers time after the presentation. However, you're welcome to ask your question in the chat box at any time. Today's presenters are Robin Finlay, Senior Fisheries Scientists from the SPC's FAME Division Stock Assessment Team. They will provide a brief overview of the harvest strategy approach for fisheries management with specific reference to the Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, as well as information on the modeling approaches used to develop and test candidate management procedures. Before I hand over to Robert and Finlay, or to Robert Scott in this case, another reminder to the audience that we would really appreciate if you completed the survey. It takes approximately 2 minutes to complete and the link is in the chat box. Robert, over to you. You can now share your screen. You're given co-presenter or co-host rights.
Okay, thanks, Alex, and good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you can all see my screen now. And
Robert, we can see your screen, but we see presentation file rather than presentation, and we can hear you well. And now we can see the third screen, which is presenter screen rather than the presentation screen.
Okay.
So you might want to unshare the screen and share it again and select the window, presentation window, rather than presentation screen.
Okay, is that working now?
No, it's still the same. So it's probably better that you unshare the screen and start again.
Okay.
Or just press display settings.
Apologies, everyone. Just bear with me for a second. Okay, have I got that this time?
No, we see the presenter's screen again rather than presentation.
If you click on display settings on the top left after show taskbar, yes, and then swap. Yeah, click on that one. And then swap presenter, yes. Yep.
Okay.
Excellent, you're ready to go.
Okay, well, apologies about that, everyone. Thanks, and good afternoon. So as Alex mentioned, this is a broad overview of the tuna MSE project. The project is set up really to facilitate and support the development of harvest strategy approaches through the Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, the WCPFC. And it falls into two main components in terms of the work involved. One is a sort of technical modeling and simulation component, and the other part is a fairly extensive capacity building and stakeholder engagement component. And I'm going to talk for a little bit about some of the work that we've done to date in terms of the simulation modeling and the testing the framework. And then Finley's going to pick up and talk about some of the further challenges that we face in progressing that work, and also a little bit about the stakeholder engagement and capacity building component. So in around about 2014, the WCPFC committed to developing a harvest strategy approach for its key tuna stocks. And for the work that we're conducting under this project, we're mostly looking at skipjack, albacore, bigeye, and yellowfin. And certainly for the work that we've conducted so far, there's been a focus on skipjack and albacore. And as it progresses, we'll pick up some of the issues around bigeye and yellowfin as well. The convention area is of the WCPFC is shown inside that red box there. And then across that region, there are stock assessments that are routinely conducted for those fisheries. And those stock assessments typically have a spatial structure to them. So on the right-hand side there, you can see the 8-box spatial structure that's assumed for the skipjack stock assessment model. That spatial structure differs across most of the stock assessments, so it's not consistently the same spatial structure that's assumed for each of the assessments. So why would, just to talk a little bit about why you might want to develop a harvest strategy in the first place. And quite a nice example of some of the situations that want to be avoided is shown here through this time series plot of Chilean jack mackerel, which illustrates this quite nicely. You can see, if I can turn my laser pointer on. Essentially, this is showing a time series plot of the status of the stock and the fishery through time, in terms of the abundance of the stock along the x-axis and the level of exploitation that it's been subject to along the y-axis here. And it starts here in 1970 with the stock in relatively healthy condition, high abundance, low exploitation rates. And you can see that over time, exploitation increased until the stock started to decline quite rapidly, and quite quickly ended up in this sort of undesirable state of very high exploitation rates and low abundance. And once you get here, your options are fairly limited. You're into recovery and rebuilding measures, and you have to cut your catches and your fishing effort quite substantially to try to rebuild the stock. And that stock doesn't rebuild straight away. There's a time lag involved. It takes a few years before it moves back into this sort of relatively healthy status. And then as soon as it got here, there was pressure again to open up the fishery, to increase catches, and that just pushed it back into this sort of, again, unsustainable status, and back into a second round of rebuilding and recovery measures, from which the stock very slowly recovered back into this status here. So you can see that's quite an undesirable way to manage a fishery. It involves these quite painful rebuilding processes, and something that you probably want to avoid. When you look at the factors that lead to that, there's perhaps a lot of mitigating factors involved in it, but very often by far the most important or the most sort of consequential thing is a time lag in the implementation of appropriate management action. And this time lag arises in a lot of cases through the negotiation process and the haggling process that follows the stock assessments, where managers decide what management action needs to be implemented in the coming years. So very often that management action gets watered down and delayed, and it leads to this sort of thing. So in an attempt to try to avoid that from happening, the harvest strategy approach is being developed and pushed in a lot of fora. And it's worth saying that that situation is by no means unique to Chilean jack mackerel. It's a pattern that you see across quite a large number of fisheries, although we haven't seen it so far in the stocks that we're considering for the WCPFC. But it certainly remains a risk and something that people are keen to take measures to try to avoid happening sort of beforehand, proactively. So the key thing in the harvest strategy approach is that it contains this tailored process for determining stock status and along with predefined rules for managing the fishery. So as Doug Butterworth describes this process, it's agreeing to the rules of the game before you play it. Every year you determine your stock status, and then rather than deciding what management action you need to take, that management action is pre-agreed and predefined and has already been sort of thought through. So when developing these management procedures and these sets of rules, it's a good idea to have some idea of what it is that you want to get out of the fishery in the first place. So this whole process starts with really looking at your management objectives and deciding what it is that you want to achieve and over what timescale you want to achieve them. Bearing in mind that different groups and different organizations will have different objectives and different priorities. So part of this process is also not just working out what those objectives are and what the most important objectives are, but also trying to determine what potential trade-offs might be between achieving one objective versus achieving another. We'll come back to this a little bit later in the process. So once you've decided what your objectives are, it's not too difficult to come up with a procedure for estimating the status of the stock and determining some management action that you think is probably likely to achieve those objectives. And this is what we're terming the management procedure. It essentially comprises three components. There's a data collection component. Using those data, you estimate the status of the stock, and then based on that estimate of the stock status, you feed that into some harvest control rule that tells you how much fishing you can apply in the next year, whether that's in terms of total catches or total effort. So you can see here that in each of our management periods, we've got 10 management periods here, and at each step in that management period, we apply that that management procedure. So we collect some data from the fishery, we use those data to estimate stock status, and then we apply our harvest control rule. And at each of these steps, we apply exactly the same management procedure. We collect the same types of data, we use the same approach to estimate stock status, and we use the same harvest control rule, with a view to ultimately attaining our management objectives. So obviously you'd want to test this beforehand to see really two things. Firstly, is it likely to achieve your management objectives? And secondly, is it robust to uncertainty? So by robustness to uncertainty, we know, for example, that we don't have perfect knowledge about the status of the stocks and that we don't have perfect stock assessments, and that leads to not necessarily perfect information leading into our management advice. We know, for example, that around many of these sort of biological components of growth, natural mortality, fecundity, maturity estimates, are all subject to some level of uncertainty. And we can see here over time that when we run our stock assessments, we try to incorporate as much of that uncertainty as we can. That gives us some idea of what the historical trajectory of the stock might have been in the past, and what the bounds might be on our current estimates of stock status. And from this plot here, you can see that these two shaded areas show a comparison of the range of values taken from the 2019 albacore assessment and the range of values achieved from the more recent 2021 albacore assessment. And these not only try to incorporate the differences in growth and maturity and natural mortality in the stock, but the difference between these two colors is also in the spatial structure of the model, for example, and the specific model settings that were used. So you can see there's a model uncertainty here, as well as data uncertainty and uncertainty around the sort of biological processes. And what we want to do is we want to test our management procedure against all of these sources of uncertainty to make sure that regardless of what is actually happening in reality in the fishery, the management procedure is at least likely to perform okay and likely to achieve our management objectives, even if there's some uncertainty around that. So no talk about MSE would be complete without the obligatory box model showing the movement of information around these various processes. On the right-hand side, we have the management procedure, this thing where we take some data, and from that we estimate the status of the stock, and we feed that into our harvest control rule, and that determines the management action, the catches or the effort levels that feed back into what we're calling our operating model. And this is a representation of the biological population dynamics and the behavior of the fishery as well. And based on the various assumptions that we put in here, the fishery responds to that. And from that, we can derive catch and effort and observation data again to feed this back into to perform the next round of the management action, the next implementation of the management procedure. So when we design this management procedure, we're thinking about our management objectives and what it is that we want to get out of the fishery. And as we're running these simulations and evaluating what's happening, we're pulling out performance indicators through this process that we can then compare to our management objectives and see if this management procedure is actually achieving what we hope it would do. So these are all the different management procedures that we want to devise and think up. We can think up several different ways of estimating stock status, several different ways of applying this harvest control rule that determines the management action feeding back into the fishery. So we have multiple management procedures that we want to test on this side of the framework. And on the left-hand side, this is where we put all of our uncertainty in. So we can simulate alternative plausible scenarios around different rates of productivity in the fishery, different dynamics and different rates of productivity in the population, and different sort of fleet dynamics or behavior in the fisheries as necessary. So just looking at some of the sources of uncertainty that we're considering in the evaluations at the moment, you can have a never-ending list of all the various sources of uncertainty, and what we've tried to do here is condense this down into the most important and the most significant ones. And once you've characterized and accounted for those most significant ones, the idea is that future data and future information should really reduce your level of uncertainty and make this grid smaller or make your results hopefully more certain. So recruitment variability is quite a big one in terms of process error, sort of particularly feeding into the future. We have two ranges of potential recruitment variability, based largely on what we've seen historically in the fishery. Similarly, we have observation error on our catch and efforts reporting based on sort of market sampling and reporting rates, as well as for the biological sampling for size composition data. And our tag recapture information. And in the case of skipjack, for example, the stock assessment and the management procedure as well are also quite heavily dependent on these tag recapture information. The next component looks at some of the model error that we're considering in the framework. And this is around some of the specific settings for the stock assessment model and the operating model that we're using around the steepness of the stock recruit relationship, which really determines how resilient the stock is at low biomass levels. This component here on the tag mixing period is the period of time that it takes for tagged fish to mix fully within the population, and it's quite an influential assumption in the stock assessment and the modeling approach, and we take a number of different assumptions for that, as well as information on the growth model, potential movement rates of the stock through the spatial structure that we assume in the stock assessment, and then this issue here related to hyperstability and catch per unit effort. So for many of our stock assessments, we assume a linear relationship between abundance and the catch rate. And this assumption here says, well, what if that relationship isn't perfectly linear? What if there's some sort of curvature to it and you actually have a hyperstable relationship? So we try to incorporate that as well. And then the last one here is related to effort creep. Effort creep relates to the technological advances over time that we know are occurring in the fishery. And a unit of effort from 5 or 10 years ago is no longer comparable to a unit of effort at today or in 5 years' time. So we try to incorporate some factors that take into account the annual increment in technical efficiency over time. And there's attempts to, every year, there's attempts to try to estimate what this effort creep value really is. It's really quite difficult to put a figure on. At the moment, we're assuming these two values as a sort of annual increment, but this is very much still an issue for discussion and debate. So we run a factorial grid. Those different levels that we're looking at give us 96 scenarios. For each of those 96 scenarios, we run 10 stochastic iterations where we change sort of future recruitment variability into future and different sort of observation error models for size composition, tag recaptures, etc. Going forwards. And that gives us 960 evaluations for every harvest control rule or management procedure that we're testing. You'll note here that all of these elements here are part of this reference case set. Just to note that we have a basic set of assumed uncertainty values that we routinely run across these 960 evaluations to develop our performance indicators that give us the information about whether we're achieving our management objectives or not. We then have this set called the robustness set, which is a hopefully still plausible but more extreme set of assumptions, and we use that as a secondary level of testing on perhaps a smaller set of scenarios to really sort of find out if we're really as robust to uncertainty as we hope we are. So whilst we're running these simulations, we need to be simulating data into the future to represent all those different scenarios that we're trying to consider. And in some cases, we do, I think, quite a good job of generating information that looks and bears a good resemblance to what we've seen historically in terms of general sort of characteristics and variability and etc. So you can see our attempt here for measuring or modeling fleet-specific catch per unit effort into the future. In other cases, this one here shows the size composition data feeding into the future, and you can see the observed size composition data on the left-hand side versus various implementations of our attempts to simulate future data. And in some cases, it's really quite difficult to simulate sort of future data that have the same properties and characteristics of the observed data. And certainly in this plot here on the right-hand side, you can see our attempts to simulate future tag recapture information. And in this case, it might be that our future tag recapture data is just a little bit too well behaved. There's elements of the uncertainty there that we're not quite fully capturing in terms of fully modeling the various scenarios that we're interested in having a look at. One step beyond that is trying to simulate scenarios for which you have no prior information or knowledge about. There's quite a lot of interest amongst the members of WCPFC to look at future climate change scenarios, and that involves sort of extrapolating beyond the bounds of anything that we've seen sort of historically. For this situation, we have two models that we're quite interested in exploring the potential for to try to feed some or try to form the basis of the scenarios that we're looking at here. In terms of CPDIM and ICAMOANA, both of these take environmental oceanographic data and use that as sort of forcing information to provide the movement dynamics of fish populations throughout the Pacific Ocean. And what we're looking to do is to generate movement dynamics under different climate scenarios for the stocks, and then to translate that from the sort of fairly fine scale, fairly sort of detailed movement rates into these sort of broader bulk transfer movement rates that we can feed into our operating model that operates at a much sort of coarser, much broader spatial structure. So just to say that we've developed a range of management procedures with a bunch of different harvest control rules. And some of these have been proposed by members, and some of these are just there to try to highlight a bit of variability in a bit of sort of extreme cases. We're in the sort of iterative process of testing these management procedures, feeding the results back, and then based on those results and the information that we get from members and stakeholders, revising that and rerunning those scenarios under different assumptions. So I've talked about most of the technical challenges that we're facing. They largely focus around the simulation of appropriate data and some of the specific challenges around the spatial components of the models that we're working with. And in a second, I'll hand over to Finlay, and he can talk a little bit more about some of the specific issues around developing sort of mixed fishery interactions and taking this from the very sort of single species approaches that we've been considering so far into a sort of mixed fishery and multi-species context. So just the final slide from me is to talk a little bit about the MSE framework. We rely very much on multi-fan CL as the basis for the operating model. And this is where we generate our population dynamics and our fleet dynamics and how we incorporate all of the uncertainty into that modeling framework. And then we rely on R for a lot of the other sort of programming elements in terms of building the estimation models, and in some cases, or building the management procedure. For some time now, we've had access to the Center for High Throughput Computing, HT Condor flock at the University of Wisconsin. And we use that quite extensively for the majority of the simulations that we're running. Over the last 12 months, our usage has been around about just over 1 million CPU hours across the Wisconsin flock. More recently, we've been given access to the MSE infrastructure, and on a slightly smaller scale, we've started running a number of simulations across that framework as well. So I'll stop talking at this point and hand across to Finlay, who can take over.
Hello, that was a relatively smooth changeover, I hope. Yeah, so I'm Finlay Scott, and I'll talk you through the last remaining bit of this presentation, slightly conscious of the time, so I'm not going to dwell too much on the detail, but if you do have any questions about any of this, then feel free, of course, to ask us when we get to the end. So one of the key issues that we're having to face with the harvest strategy development is this idea of mixed fisheries. So as Rob said, we're developing harvest strategies for skipjack, bigeye, and South Pacific albacore. But these 4 stocks are caught by an overlapping mix of fisheries with different gears in overlapping regions. And this is a figure taken from a report in 2013, where we have the different species down here and exactly sort of what gear type is fishing them. And I'm never quite sure if the idea of the figure was to help understand sort of who was catching what, or really to illustrate that it really is a big sort of spaghetti mess of interactions. But this is something that we need to be aware of. You can also see that here. This is taken from what we call the TFAR report. So up in skipjack, it tells us sort of which gear is catching what amount of the different species. So here the blue is purseine, so skipjack around here is predominantly caught by purseine, whereas sort of albacore is predominantly caught by longline in the green. And then you look at yellowfin and bigeye, and there's quite a lot of sort of mix of different gears that are going on. Again, something that we need to be aware of. Trying to put some figures on this, this is looking at the proportion of the average total catch over the last few years that is taken by what particular gear. So you can see that on the top line there we have albacore, and about 86% of that is sort of the catches coming from what we call the southern longline, and the remainder is coming from the tropical and northern longline. And for skipjack, predominantly the catches are coming from purseine, with also some pole and line and what we're calling other, which is sort of the domestic fisheries of Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. So for albacore and skipjack, there's sort of two sort of very strong fisheries, which is sort of purseine for skipjack and southern longline for albacore. But again, for bigeye and yellowfin, you can see that the picture's a lot less clear. There's a sort of a good mix of who is catching what. So this means that, or what is catching who, that I've written here. So this sort of shows that the management measures that are aimed at one particular stock can then have sort of knock-on impacts on the other stocks. And therefore, when you're developing management procedures, it may not be appropriate to consider the management of the individual stocks in isolation. So the approach that we're taking here for the harvest strategies is, well, there's several ways we could have gone forward. The way that we're currently going forward, and we'll sort of see how it goes before WCPFC sort of finally agree on it, is to develop what we're calling single stock management procedures. So Rob was talking about management procedures earlier, which is the combination of harvest control rules, estimation methods, and data collection. And we're saying here that a single stock management procedure can manage several fisheries, but it's only going to consider the status of a single stock. So the way that we're trying to divide this up is that we'll have a skipjack management procedure, which only looks at the stock status of skipjack, but will then determine the sort of fishing levels of the pole and line, purseine, and the other domestic fisheries, although the other and domestic is obviously subject to agreement. The albacore management procedure will sort of typically manage the southern longline. This is because albacore is predominantly caught by the southern longline. And then the tropical and northern longline would be managed through the bigeye management procedure. So the super awake of you will have noticed that there is no yellowfin management procedure. And so the current thinking is that if we can get these three stocks right through their sort of management procedures, then hopefully the yellowfin will also be okay. Although one thing that Rob didn't talk about is the idea of monitoring how well the harvest strategies are performing. So the yellowfin stock would of course always be monitored as we go forward. So trying to illustrate this approach, what we would have is, here's the skipjack stock and here's the skipjack management procedure. And the skipjack management procedure sort of manages the purseine, the domestic, and the pole and line fisheries. And this sort of happens, skipjack sort of is fairly well self-contained, which is partly why we've sort of developed the model for that on its own so far. We also have then albacore, which is the albacore management procedure there in green, and this would manage the southern longline and the southern troll fisheries. And again, this sort of happens independently of the skipjack model. Moving over to bigeye, we have our bigeye stock and then the bigeye management procedure. We saw in the previous slide that the bigeye management procedure would manage the tropical longline fisheries, but we know that the bigeye stock is also caught by purseine, domestic fisheries, and pole and line, which is managed through the skipjack management procedure, which only considers the stock status of skipjack. Similarly, bigeye is also fished by the southern longline fishery, which comes managed through the albacore management procedure. And it goes the other way as well, where albacore is then fished by tropical longline, and this starts to get complicated. Finally, we have yellowfin, which, as I said, doesn't have a management procedure, but it's fished by the purseines, domestics, pole and line, and the southern longline, and also the tropical longline. So the current thinking is that, yeah, the yellowfin, what we will try is that, is it possible to safely manage yellowfin, but also to achieve the yellowfin management objectives through the management procedures for the 3 other stocks. This is clearly quite a difficult modeling framework to try to implement at the moment. We're sort of doing well on the skipjack component that Rob was talking about. We're also well developed with the albacore component. And now we're starting to work on sort of the bigeye, the yellowfin. And then the really complicated part is getting these interactions. It's complicated because, as Rob showed, the operating models for the stocks often have different regional setups. So getting all the models to talk to each other is not necessarily straightforward. I'm not going to go into the technical details of that, but I'm happy to take questions on it later on. And so for the last, quickly checking his clock, the last few minutes, I'd like to just briefly speak about a really important part of the harvest strategy framework or development, which is that it is largely stakeholder driven. And this is a really important point. So the development is driven by stakeholders, and this means that the members of the WCPFC will be required to make a series of informed decisions through the development process. And this will require a dialogue between scientists and stakeholders and members. Now, given that harvest strategies are pretty new to the region, this sort of flags up that there is a strong requirement for capacity building and stakeholder engagement. And actually, the capacity building and the engagement, I think, really go hand in hand. So for the capacity building and engagement, we've really been focusing on sort of in-country workshops. Our previous experience sort of showed us that holding national in-country workshops would be a good way of trying to sort of facilitate engagement with members, but also because we might be talking about national objectives, we decided to keep them as sort of national workshops. And we started off in 2018 in Kiribati, and then over the last sort of year or so, or couple of years, we sort of went around the region running the workshops. And then we got to Papua New Guinea in 2020, and 2 weeks after that, all travel was stopped because we ran into, of course, COVID travel restrictions, which then sort of dried up the in-country workshops, apart from one that we held in New Caledonia at the beginning of this year. So for the in-country workshops, they tended to last sort of 2 to 3 days, where the first day we had the wider stakeholder group with industry, NGOs and staff from non-fishery departments. And then days 2 and 3, we focused more on staff from the fishery departments, and we didn't assume any specialist background knowledge through the workshops. We tried to sort of focus on the interests and the objectives of those countries and sort of try to specialize them as much as possible. As I said, we weren't able to travel from sort of 2020, so we started doing online workshops, and so far we've had online workshops with Tuvalu, Solomon Islands and Palau, with French Polynesia, Samoa, Tokelau, Papua New Guinea later on. As you can imagine, these were much more challenging to run. I think, without dwelling on the point, people are really quite tired of doing Zoom workshops, and it was very difficult for a number of reasons. It's difficult to read the room, so you're not quite sure. In fact, like I'm talking now, I have no idea if anyone's actually listening to me or if people are interested or engaged. That happens in the workshops too. And it's difficult to run activities. So we tried things like using Concept Board and Google Docs to various degrees of success. So although we thought they were okay, the online workshops, would still prefer to move back to doing the in-country ones when travel resumes. But since we started doing it, we've managed to reach about 260 people across the region. We've developed some interactive training tools, which I'm not going to talk too much about, but we find they've been really helpful in workshops, particularly for explaining some of the more technical ideas like harvest control rules. So you can make your own harvest control rule, see how well it performs, and sort of measure its performance using performance indicators and compare between different harvest control rules. The addresses are there. I think the presentation might be available to everyone. Be really pleased if people went to go and check these out and gave us some feedback as to what they thought. Similarly, we've developed some interactive decision-making tools, and this is a big point, is that one of the really key decisions that WCPFC members will have to make is what is the selection of the preferred management procedure. Doing all that MSE analysis that Rob was talking about can yield a lot of results, so it can be quite tricky to navigate all the way through the results. So hopefully there's this tool that we've called Pimple that we've developed so far for the skipjack management procedures allows people to sort of drill down into the results and really focus on the performance indicators that are of interest, and then eliminate the management procedures and harvest control rules that aren't meeting their objectives. As well as these, as a final note, we've started developing a Moodle course for the introduction to harvest strategies, and the address for that is there. We have a poster. I think this is just still the draft version of the poster. There is an updated, finalized one that is going to be circulated to the regional fisheries departments to remind people that this work is going on. In 2019 until 2020, we had Janti Singh as a Pacific Island fisheries professional with us at SPC, which was a one-year placement working with the harvest strategy team. And this sort of represents a very specific and focused type of capacity building. And we really enjoyed having Janti on the team, and she made a real contribution to the work. We have a Slack channel that's available to all members around the region, where we have sort of more informal chat about harvest strategy stuff. And we also made a film, which we don't have time to show you, but we're really pleased about. It's a training film and features many sort of familiar faces from around the region, and stars Marino Wichman from the Cook Islands on a voyage through the main concepts of harvest strategy. I'm going to leave it there. I had a slide on what are the main challenges we faced with the stakeholder engagement, but I'm more than happy to talk about that. But for the moment, I'll probably pause there, as we've just got, I can see 14 minutes left for questions. So I can, yeah, I'll just hand over back to Alex, and I'll stop sharing now.
Many thanks, Finlay. Many thanks, Rob. Excellent presentations. I'm sorry we couldn't see the film that you recorded. My understanding is that Marino is from FFA too. He's from Cook Islands, but he works for FFA, another excellent collaboration between organizations, I believe.
I think just to be, Marino doesn't work for FFA. In fact, he's about to be employed by SPC. So Marino, okay. Marino was a Pacific Island fisheries professional at SPC.
Okay.
And then after returning to the Cooks, he's back here. But actually, it's a good point. I forgot to mention, and it's a really important point, that the engagement and capacity building workshops were carried out with FFA, who are our partners on this project. So I wanted to say a big thank you to them, and apologies for not mentioning them earlier.
Well, I'm glad I raised that question then. Okay, thank you very much again. We have 15 minutes, actually just over 10 minutes for questions. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box, hence I'm opening the floor for questions. Please go ahead and just unmute your microphone and ask questions. I can probably start with the first one. You mentioned several different methods for accessing stock, for assessing stock levels. How do you know which one is valid, and I mean, how do you compare that? I mean, what are your methods for deciding on the validity of the methods?
I'm going to let Rob answer this one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Alex. We have a current stock assessment process at the moment that provides the advice on the status of the stocks directly to the WCPFC, and based on that, there's a discussion and negotiation around what the management advice should be, and those stock assessments or that advice sort of assumes that what we have is the best available science on the status of the stock. We're using those stock assessments very much as the basis or the starting point for the operating models that we're developing. So I guess there's a couple of ways of looking at this idea of assessing the status of the stock and developing those models. The operating model is typically a fairly complicated, fairly sort of involved statistical model to sort of generate the information around the biological processes of the stock and the status of the fishery. And that's quite handy in terms of an operating model for incorporating various sources of uncertainty and modeling the various scenarios that we're interested in looking at. But then ideally within the management procedure, what you want is a much more simple, much more sort of straightforward approach to estimating stock status, with a view to making that whole management procedure much more transparent, and sort of easy for people to understand how the advice sort of flows through the system. So we kind of have two levels of stock assessment. One is in developing those operating models that kind of cover all of the aspects and all of the areas of uncertainty. And the other one is a much more simple process to try to get just a general view of the status of the stock that we can feed into, or that we can use to inform that harvest control rule. So as you say, the challenge there is determining how reliable that simple method is at informing the status of the stock. And to some extent, any bias in that method can be accommodated for by the harvest control rule. The harvest control rule can correct for bias in that simple stock assessment model, so long as that bias is consistent and the same in each time you run it. But that's very much another element of the and some of the challenges that we face is trying to find that estimate of stock status that we can use within the management procedure. We've tried using very simple CPUE or length-based approaches, and we find that it's actually quite difficult to find measures of CPUE that really give an accurate indication of stock status or stock abundance in the fishery. And increasingly we're turning to sort of slightly more complex model-based approaches. But we're trying to sort of minimize the level of complexity of those models in the management procedure as much as possible.
Thank you, Rob. Any other questions from the floor? Okay, we have Simon Nicole. Simon, please unmute and ask your question.
Hi, Rob, Finlay. Great talk. Really nice to see kind of everything introduced at a really plain language level for what is a really complex set of models. I was just wondering whether you guys wanted to comment on how important it is to also look towards the kind of exceptional circumstances that are outside the variability that you might be initially testing, and what sort of work, or I guess indicators, that need to be developed so that you know whether or not the system has changed outside of the testing space that the MSE was undertaken in. Do you have any comments around that at all?
I'll jump in there, and Finlay can pick up anything that I don't cover. But yeah, thanks, Simon. It's a really important point, and it's something that we haven't really addressed during this presentation very much at all. Is that, yes, you know, as you implement your management procedure and this process is feeding through, and your automated management approaches are being applied, there's absolutely a need to be monitoring that through time, and just making sure that what's happening, what you expected to happen is actually what's happening in the process, and that you're not veering off course too much in any direction. And part of that is understanding what the range of expected values are, and how likely and how probable you think they are. So this issue of exceptional circumstances, where you know, something untoward, something unexpected happens in the fishery that wasn't taken account of when you tested your management procedure. You need a process for identifying when that has happened, and a process for doing something else in the event that does occur. So at what point do you abandon your management procedure and step away from it and do something else because, I don't know, there's been a recruitment failure, or there's been a you know, sudden change in climate or stock status, or something like that.
Thank you, Rob. It looks like Finlay hasn't got much to add here on this one. Finlay, do you want to correct me?
No, not much to add. Only that, yeah, there's sort of these things called exceptional circumstances as part of the monitoring strategy, which is part of the harvest strategy. And I think as Rob was saying, these tend to be, the idea is that they're fairly loosely defined within the monitoring strategy. So you don't make up a really thorough, detailed list of exactly what constitutes an exceptional circumstance when you're all agreeing what a harvest strategy is. But on the flip side of that, they're not supposed to be used as an excuse for people just to basically stop the management procedure. So if the decisions that are being sort of coming out of it is not something they particularly like, they can't just stick their hand up and say, oh, exceptional circumstance, we don't like it. So there has to be a balance between, is it a real kind of exceptional circumstance, and is it just we don't like what's currently going on? So they're not really to be used as a way of sort of getting of stopping the management procedure from doing its job unless it's really shown to be not working properly.
Thank you, Finlay. Or another question from Francisco. Thanks for a very interesting presentation. How do you guys see the potential of harnessing the so far private data from acoustic buoys, on drifting DFADs, independent data for stock assessment, per scene, CPUE standardization, and the potential to be expanded on other areas of the reference framework? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I can sort of quickly jump in. I think as Rob mentioned near the beginning of his presentation, sort of the management procedure comes sort of in a couple of different flavors. You can have a stock assessment as your sort of estimate of stock status, or you can have what you'd call an empirical method, which might estimate something like CPUE or some other metric of stock status, and use that to then feed the harvest control rule. And so there is the potential of using sort of multiple sources of information in your harvest control rule to have sort of multiple inputs to that. So something like the information from the acoustic buoys and so on could potentially be used as one of the inputs, I guess, to a harvest control rule. I think one of the challenging things might be trying to simulate that kind of data inside the MSE framework. It's already quite difficult to simulate something sort of like CPUE and so on. But yeah, it's certainly a good idea. And don't know if Rob wants to step in with some ideas as well.
No, not really. But just so it's certainly an interesting area. I think there's some more work to be done on, before we can develop an abundance index from that information. But it's certainly promising and something that's will be pretty interesting as it develops to see how it can feed into this process, along with developments in electronic reporting and electronic monitoring, which can all sort of also be used in some of these processes as well as they develop and become more widely used.
Thank you very much, Rob. Thank you very much, Finlay. Any other questions from the floor? We have another few minutes. I could probably pose the last question. You mentioned your collaboration with the University of Wisconsin and collaboration with MSE. How important are high-performance computers in your work?
I think the short answer is we wouldn't be able to do any of this if we didn't have that kind of access. It's simply, the runtime, the simulations that we're running, they're fairly coarse-grained, they're fairly lengthy. So we have for a single set of or a single evaluation, we'll talk about maybe 15 hours or so. And as I mentioned, it's sort of, in the last 12 months, we've over 1 million hours of CPU hours across the CHTC Wisconsin grid alone. So no, it's pretty crucial. We have a small in-house condor flock within SPC, but that's really used for the stock assessment process. I think, you know, even with the machines that we have in house, we still wouldn't be able to really run the sort of evaluations that we have. So yes, it's pretty critical. And we're very grateful for the access that the people are giving to us.
Thank you very much, Rob. Any other burning questions from the floor? It looks like there's none.